The Dowager Duchess of Northwell, Dorothea, placed her teacup in its saucer with a sound like a tiny, brittle bone snapping. 5 years, she said to the silent room. 5 years, and the curtains of the west wing at Oak Hall remain drawn. Her companion, a timid woman, whose name the Duchess perpetually forgot, made a small, sympathetic noise. It was the only sort of noise she ever made. They write from London, of course, Dorothea continued, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window of the Dower House. They inquire after his health. What they mean is, they inquire after his eligibility. A dukedom, even one with a master who cannot see his own hand in front of his face, is still a dukedom. The fortune is still vast. The name still carries the weight of centuries. She made a sharp, impatient gesture. They send their daughters. Oh, not openly. A visit to a cousin in York, a sudden desire to see the moors in autumn. They arrive for tea. They are seated in the drawing room. Benjamin is correct. He is always correct. He answers their questions. He asks after their families. And all the while, they are staring at his eyes, which do not see them, staring at the way his hand hovers for a moment before finding his cup, staring at the stillness of him, the terrible, rigid control. A pause. The rain drummed a soft tattoo against the glass. They last one afternoon, the Duchess said, her voice dropping. Sometimes, if they are particularly resilient, they stay for dinner. They listen to the silence of that great house. They feel the weight of what is missing. And they flee. They write their polite little notes of refusal, and they flee back to London, to men who are whole. A companion murmured something about God's will. "Do not speak to me of God's will," Dorothea snapped, though without real heat. The anger had been worn smooth by years of grief. God did not hold the powder keg that took my son's sight. Men did that. And now men and their simpering daughters are completing the work, entombing him alive at Oak Hall. He was not made for it. He was a boy who loved light and colour. He built that collection of orchids with his father, for God's sake. He knew everyone by its proper name. She fell silent, lost in a memory of a laughing boy with ash-brown hair and his father's tawny eyes that had once been so full of life. Now, the Duke of Northwell was a ghost in his own home, his absence a palpable presence even to the villagers who rarely saw him. The great house was shuttered. The master was blind. And for 5 years, society had whispered and peered, and then, decisively, looked away. Isabel Ventan arrived at the Dower House 2 days later, on a carriage sent to meet the public coach in York. She was 28, and carried herself with a quiet composure that was often mistaken for plainness. She was not plain. She was handsome, with a strong, intelligent face, clear grey eyes, and hands that were elegant but capable. She wore a travelling dress of sober grey, impeccably clean, but visibly mended at the cuff. Her entire worldly fortune was contained in 2 trunks and a large flat portfolio bound in worn leather. She had been summoned by the Dowager Duchess of Northwell. The letter had been brief, speaking of a position to catalogue and restore a collection of botanicals. The salary offered was more than generous. It was a lifeline. Since her father's death 6 months prior, Isabel had found that a woman's deep knowledge of Linnaean classification and botanical illustration was a commodity with very little market value, especially when unaccompanied by a dowry. She was shown into the same drawing room where the Duchess had lamented her son's fate. Dorothea was seated, waiting. She did not rise, but her eyes, a sharp, penetrating blue, missed nothing. Not the mended cuff, Not the resolute set of Isabel's jaw, not the portfolio, held as if it were a shield. "Miss Wentarn," the Duchess began, foregoing pleasantries, "you are the daughter of Alistair Wentarn." "I am, Your Grace." "I knew your father. A brilliant man. He once identified a species of moorland gentian for my husband, from a single pressed petal. He had an eye for detail. Do you share his gift?" Without a word, Isabel placed the portfolio on a low table and untied the ribbons. She did not present the contents with a flourish, but simply opened it for inspection. The Duchess leaned forward. The pages were filled with illustrations of breathtaking precision and artistry, a spray of foxglove, each bell rendered with such care one could almost see the tiny hairs inside, the intricate, alien architecture of a passion flower, the delicate veining on a fern frond. Beside each, in a neat, scholarly hand, was the plant's name, its properties, its needs. It was her father's work, continued and perfected. It was her life's work. Dorothea turned the pages slowly, one after another, a catalogue of quiet, focused brilliance. She looked from a drawing of an impossibly complex orchid to Isabel's calm face. "The glass houses at Oak Hall were once my husband's pride," the Duchess said, her voice softer now. My son shared that pride. Since the war, they have been neglected. The collection is one of the finest in the north of England. Or it was. It requires a firm, knowledgeable hand to bring it back from the brink. The head gardener is a capable man with roses, but he is lost amongst the epiphytes. Isabel listened, her hands folded in her lap. She understood this was more than an interview for a post as a gardener. "The position would require you to live at Oak Hall," Dorothea stated. It was not a question. "I understand. The house is quiet," an understatement so vast it was almost a physical thing in the room. "My son, the Duke, values his privacy. He has not been well." This was the heart of it. Isabel met the Duchess's gaze directly. "Your Grace, your letter was clear about the duties. I am a botanist. I would be there to tend the collection." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, showed in the Duchess's eyes. The girl was direct. She did not pry. "Indeed," Dorothea said, closing the portfolio. "That is the position. The work is yours, Miss Wentarn, if you will have it." "I will," Isabel said simply. There was no other choice. But as she accepted, she felt a strange certainty that the orchids and the ferns were only the beginning of the task that awaited her at Oak Hall. Oak Hall appeared out of the Yorkshire mist, a great beast of a house, stone-grey and sprawling. It was magnificent, but it seemed to hold its breath. A pall of stillness hung over the park, where ancient oaks stood like sombre sentinels. A wing of the house, the west wing Isabel later learned, was entirely shuttered, its windows like blind eyes. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Finch, met her at the door. She was a tall, severe woman in black bombazine, her face a study in grim loyalty. She looked Isabel up and down, her expression making it clear she expected this new arrival to last no longer than the titled ladies who came for tea. "Miss Wentarn," she said, her voice as starched as her apron. "Her Grace, the Dowager, has informed us of your arrival. I am to show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 7. The Duke dines alone." The implication was clear. You will not be troubling His Grace. The house was cold. Not merely the chill of a large stone building in autumn, but a deep, settled cold that came from a lack of life. Fires were laid in the grates, but not lit. Dust sheets shrouded furniture in the grander reception rooms. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and sorrow. Isabel's rooms were in the east wing, comfortable and well-appointed, but isolated. From her window, she could see the glass houses, a series of crystalline domes and long vaulted roofs, dulled by grime and encroaching ivy. They looked like a forgotten cathedral to a forgotten god. The next morning, she went to them. Mrs. Finch had given her a key, a heavy iron thing that felt like a key to a prison. But when Isabel turned it in the lock and pushed open the door, she felt not confinement, but a rush of purpose. The air inside was warm, humid, and thick with the scent of decay and tenacious life. It was a jungle in chaos. Rare orchids, priceless beyond measure, drooped from their baskets, their aerial roots grasping at nothing. Ferns had overgrown their beds, choking out more delicate species. A thick layer of green slime coated the inside of the glass, filtering the already weak sunlight to a submarine gloom. It was a disaster. It was perfect. Isabel took off her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves. She spent the first day just observing, taking notes in a small, leather-bound book. She walked the aisles, her footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. She touched a leaf here, examined a withered bloom there, her mind already sorting, planning, classifying the ruin. She found the gardener's shed, the tools rusted but serviceable. She found the cisterns, the water brackish but usable. She had everything she needed. For a week she saw no one but a footman who brought her a tray for luncheon, and Mrs. Finch, whose dour expression never altered. The silence of the great house was her companion. And then, in the middle of her second week, she felt a change in the air. She was on a ladder, carefully cleaning the panes of glass with a mixture of vinegar and water, when she sensed it. A presence. She paused, cloth in hand, and looked down. He was standing just inside the door of the main conservatory, a tall, still figure outlined against the grey light. The Duke of Northwell. He wore a perfectly tailored coat of dark grey wool, his cravat immaculately white. His ash-brown hair was neat, but his face was a rigid mask of control. He held a long, slender cane of dark malacca wood, its tip resting on the stone floor. And his eyes were open, a strange, clouded, tawny brown, but they were fixed on a point somewhere beyond her, seeing nothing. Isabel's heart gave a single, hard thump. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply waited, perched on her ladder. He took a slow step into the humid air, his head tilted as if listening. He breathed in, a long and deliberate inhalation, tasting the scents of damp earth, of her vinegar water, of the faint, spicy fragrance of a struggling orchid nearby. His face remained impassive, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He stood there for a full 5 minutes, a clock ticking somewhere in the silent house, the drip of water from a leaky pipe, the scritch of her cloth as she unconsciously tightened her grip. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and was gone. The space where he had stood seemed colder, emptier. Isabel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She understood now. The glass houses were not just a neglected collection. They were his territory, and she was an intruder. Benjamin knew the moment she arrived. He had felt the shift in the house's rhythm. A new footstep, lighter than Mrs. Finch's grim tread, softer than the scuttling maid's. A door in the east wing that now opened and closed in the mornings. A scent he did not recognize, something clean and faintly floral, like crushed violet leaves. He had spent 5 years perfecting his fortress of solitude. Oak Hall was his world, a map of sound and scent and memory he could navigate with unerring precision. He knew the 7th step on the grand staircase creaked. He knew the exact distance from his chair in the library to the fireplace. He knew the hollow echo of the great hall and the muffled quiet of the tapestry room. He had built this world to protect himself from the alternative, a world of blurred, meaningless light and shadow, of sudden obstacles, of pitying faces he could not see, but could always feel. The woman, Miss Wentarn, his mother had written, was an unwelcome disruption. He had agreed to her appointment in a moment of weakness, worn down by his mother's insistence and a flicker of painful memory of what the glass houses used to be. He had expected a fussy, elderly spinster who would potter about for a month and then leave, defeated. He had not expected the quiet, purposeful energy that now radiated from the conservatories. He had not expected the scent of vinegar, a smell of work and restoration. He had gone there to reclaim his territory, to stand in the doorway and, by his silent, forbidding presence, drive her out. He had expected her to startle, to stammer an apology, to scurry away. She had done none of those things. She had simply stayed where she was, on her ladder, watching him. He had felt her gaze. It was not the curious, horrified stare of the London ladies. It was not the pitying glance of the servants. It was steady, unflinching, as if she were merely observing another specimen that had wandered into her domain. The novelty of it was as unsettling as a piece of furniture moved in his path. He found himself drawn back, day after day. He would not enter fully, but stand in the doorway, listening. He catalogued the sounds of her work. The decisive snip of shears, trimming dead foliage. The soft scrape of a trowel in a pot. The rustle of paper as she took her notes. The methodical swish and squeak of the cloth against glass. They were sounds of competence, of order being imposed on chaos. It was a language he understood. He learned her routines. In the morning, she cleaned. In the afternoon, she repotted. In the quiet of the late day, she would sit at the old wooden bench, and he would hear the scratch of her pen, the whisper of a page turning in a reference book. One afternoon, a week after his first appearance, he smelled something new. A sharp, almost medicinal fragrance mixed with the damp earth. He stepped just inside the door, his cane tapping once on the flagstones. "The air has changed," he said. His voice came out harsh, a rusty hinge. He heard a soft intake of breath from the far end of the conservatory. She had not been aware of him this time. There was a pause. He braced himself for a flustered reply. "I am treating the orchids for scale," she said. Her voice was calm, even-toned. It carried clearly in the humid air. "It is a mixture of alcohol and oil of neem." He was silent. She had answered him directly, a simple statement of fact. No apology for the smell, no deference, no surprise at his sudden speech. "Scale," he repeated, the word a memory. The Phalaenopsis amabilis was always susceptible. "It is," she confirmed. "I have isolated the 3 affected plants. The rest of the collection appears healthy, merely neglected." He could almost see it. Her hands moving with practiced care over the leaves, her brow furrowed in concentration. The image was so vivid, it was an ache. "You are a long way from the door, Your Grace," she said, her voice still perfectly level. "There is a stack of clay pots to your left. I would not wish you to stumble." He froze. She had not rushed to his side. She had not cried out a warning. She had given him information. Clear, precise, usable information. He took a careful step back, his cane finding the edge of the pots, exactly where she had said they would be. "Thank you, Miss Wentarn," he said, the words stiff. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He turned and walked away, his heart hammering against his ribs with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was the terrifying, exhilarating shock of being seen. Not as a duke, not as a cripple, but as a man who simply needed to know where the obstacles were. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The encounters in the glass house became a strange, unspoken ritual. Benjamin would appear each afternoon, and Isabel would continue her work, her movements economical and serene. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they stood in a shared silence, broken only by the sounds of the garden. He began to ask questions. Is the Cattleya labiata still in the north corner? It is, she would reply. It has not bloomed in some time, but the pseudobulbs are strong. I repotted it yesterday. The scent, he said one day, his head tilted. Cinnamon. Stanhope tigrina, she confirmed, without looking up from the fern she was dividing. It opened this morning. The flower will only last 2 or 3 days. He took a hesitant step further into the conservatory. Describe it. Isabel paused in her work. She looked at the bizarre, magnificent flower hanging upside down from its basket, its waxy, yellow-spotted petals like the wings of some great insect. She thought for a moment, choosing her words not for poetry, but for precision. It is the size of a man's fist, she began. The color is a pale, creamy yellow, heavily mottled with deep maroon, like dried blood. The petals are thick, as if sculpted from wax. They curve backwards from the center. The column is long and winged, and from the base 2 curved horns protrude. It looks less like a flower, and more like a creature from the deep sea. He was silent for so long, she thought he had not been listening. Then he gave a short, almost inaudible sigh. Yes, that is exactly right. He knew these plants. He knew them by touch, by scent, by the memories of sight he kept locked away. Her words were not a poor substitute for vision. They were a key, unlocking rooms in his mind that had been sealed for 5 years. One evening, he was in the library, a room he favored for its acoustics. The thick rugs and book-lined walls softened sound, making it easier for him to place objects to feel at ease. A footman had just lit the fire and left, the scent of wood smoke a comfort. There was a soft knock at the door. Enter, he called, his voice sharp. The door opened. He smelled her scent first, that clean violet leaf fragrance. Your Grace? Miss Wentarn. He did not turn his head. He sat in his usual wing-back chair by the fire, his posture rigid. What is it? Mrs. Finch informed me you had not requested a reader this evening. I have finished my work for the day. I wondered if you would permit me to read to you. He had readers, of course. A series of vicars and impoverished local gentlemen who came and droned the newspapers or dry agricultural treatises at him. He endured them. He did not enjoy them. What would you read? He asked, his tone daring her to suggest a sentimental novel. I have a new monograph from the Royal Horticultural Society on the hybridization of pelargoniums. A faint, almost smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second, then vanished. Of course she would. Very well, he said. You may read. She sat in the chair opposite him, the firelight flickering between them. Her voice, when she began, was the same as it was in the glass house. Calm, clear, measured. She did not stumble over the Latin terms. She did not inject false drama into the prose. She simply read, her voice a steady, pleasant instrument. He closed his eyes, though it made no difference to what he saw. He listened, and for the first time in 5 years, the words were not just a stream of sound. They were pictures. He could see the diagrams she was not describing, could imagine the shapes of the leaves, the colors of the petals. When she finished the first chapter, she paused. "Shall I continue?" "Yes," he said, more quickly than he intended. The reading became their evening ritual. From pelargoniums they moved to travelogues of the Amazon, to histories of Rome, to the novels of Mr. Scott, which she read with a quiet intelligence that gave each character a distinct voice without resorting to theatrics. During one of these evenings, he rose to add a log to the fire, a task he knew by heart. But his foot caught the leg of a small, low table a maid had carelessly misplaced. He stumbled, catching himself on the mantelpiece, his cane clattering to the floor. A hot wave of shame washed over him. He stood frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the stone, his whole body radiating fury at his own helplessness, at the carelessness of a world that did not think about where it left its furniture. He waited for it. The gasp, the flutter of hands, the rush to his side, the mortifying, "Oh, you poor man." There was only silence. Then Isabel's calm voice from her chair. "The table is 2 inches further to the right than it was this morning. The log basket is directly by your left foot." He did not move. He just breathed. In, out. The rage subsided, leaving a strange, hollow feeling. "Your cane," she said, her voice still even, "has rolled under my chair. I can retrieve it for you, or you may find it if you take 3 steps toward the sound of my voice." He turned his head slowly in her direction. He took 1 step, then another, then a third. His knee brushed against the soft wool of her skirt. He knelt, his hand sweeping under her chair, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth wood of his cane. He rose slowly and returned to the fireplace, this time navigating the treacherous table with ease. He placed the log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. He stood with his back to her, gripping the mantel. "Why are you not like the others?" he asked the fire, his voice low and raw. "Why do you not offer me your pity?" He heard the soft rustle of her dress as she stood. She did not approach him. "Pity is for the helpless, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not soft now. It was as clear and hard as winter ice. "I have observed you are anything but. You are a man who has suffered a great wound, and you are living with it. That deserves respect. Pity is an insult." He flinched as if she had struck him. No one had ever spoken to him so plainly. No one had dared. He had been drowning in pity for 5 years. The cloying, suffocating pity of his mother, the fearful pity of the servants, the condescending pity of the world. He had come to define himself by it, to wear their low expectations like a shroud. Isabel went on, had just ripped it to shreds. He turned from the fire, his unseeing eyes fixed in her direction. He could not see her face, but he could imagine it. Calm, strong, unafraid. "Read to me, Miss Wentarn," he said, his voice hoarse. She returned to her seat and picked up the book. Her voice, when she began to read, was once again perfectly steady. But something had changed in the space between them. A wall had been breached, and in its place, a foundation was being laid. The thaw was not a sudden event. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, like a glacier's retreat. It was in the way Benjamin began to spend more of his day in the glass houses, not as a silent sentinel at the door, but as a participant. He would sit on the bench while she worked, his hands resting on his cane, and they would talk. He told her about the plants, stories from his boyhood, of expeditions with his father to find rare specimens. He spoke of the scent of a particular orchid, blooming at night in a humid valley in Brazil, a story told to him by a fellow collector. He spoke of everything but the war. The war was a locked room inside him, the door bolted fast. In turn, Isabel spoke of her own father, of their shared passion, of long, happy days spent in the botanical gardens at Kew, sketching and learning. She spoke of a life that was not grand, but was rich in knowledge and quiet joys. He listened, and in listening, he began to feel the oppressive silence of his own house recede. One afternoon, she was tending to a new acquisition, a paphiopedilum with a strange, pouch-like flower. "The texture is unusual," she remarked, more to herself than to him. "It feels like suede." He was silent for a moment. "I remember," he said, his voice quiet. A sudden impulse, brave and reckless, seized her. "Would you like to?" she asked. He stiffened. The offer hung in the air between them. An offer of contact, an offer of trust. For 5 years, he had shrunk from the guiding hands of others, the hesitant pats on the arm, the physical manifestations of their pity. He did not answer, but he did not refuse. Slowly, Isabel put down her tools. She moved to his side, her skirts whispering against the stone floor. She did not take his hand. Instead, she gently touched his wrist, a light, firm pressure. "The plant is just here," she said softly. He allowed her to guide him. His hand was stiff in hers, his muscles tense. She led his fingers not to the flower itself, but to the pot, then up the stem, a familiar path. His fingers brushed against a leaf, tracing its shape. Then she guided him to the bloom. His forefinger and thumb closed delicately around the pouch. A tremor ran through his hand. He felt the strange, velvety texture, the complex architecture of the flower. A shudder went through his entire body. He had not touched a new flower in 5 years. His hand remained there, cradling the bloom, for a long time. Isabel did not move, her hand still resting lightly on his wrist. The contact was not personal, not yet. It was practical. A bridge, but it was a bridge that spanned a chasm of loneliness and pain. When he finally drew his hand back, his face was pale, but the rigid mask had softened. A crack had appeared. "Thank you," he said, the words barely audible. The outside world intruded in the form of Lady Antonia Pembridge. She was a neighbour, a widow of considerable means, and even more considerable self-importance. She arrived one afternoon in a high-perched carriage, her arrival announced by a flurry of activity from the terrified staff. Isabel was with Benjamin in the library. She had been describing the autumn colours in the park, the fiery reds of the Virginia creeper against the grey stone of the walls. He had been listening, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen it before. Mrs. Finch announced Lady Pembridge with the air of one announcing a plague. Benjamin's face instantly hardened, the mask of cold indifference snapping back into place. "Show her in, Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. Lady Antonia swept in, a whirlwind of lavender silk and cloying perfume. "My dear Northwell," she exclaimed, her voice oozing a theatrical sympathy. "I heard you were receiving visitors, and I could not stay away. And you must be the young person dear Dorothea has hired to look after the flowers." She turned her sharp, inquisitive eyes on Isabel. "A botanist? How? Very useful? Oak Hall has been such a tomb for so long. It is a mercy to see some life being brought back into it, even if it is only the vegetable kind." Isabel inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Lady Pembridge." "My poor dear Northwell," the woman continued, turning back to Benjamin, and completely ignoring Isabel. "You are looking, well, all things considered. We miss you in the county. You must not shut yourself away, so. It is not healthy. You must allow your friends to support you in your affliction. Benjamin stood, his body ramrod straight. I am quite well, Antonia. Thank you for your concern. Miss Wentarn and I were occupied. It was a dismissal, polite but unmistakable. Lady Pembridge's smile tightened. Her gaze flickered between the Duke's blank face and Isabel's calm one. She scented a mystery, and it displeased her that she was not a part of it. Of course, she said, gathering her silks. I shall not keep you from your duties. But do consider my words, Northwell. The world has not forgotten you, even if you have forgotten it. She swept out, leaving a trail of perfume and resentment. Benjamin stood for a long time after she was gone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. A tomb, he said, the words tasting like poison. My affliction. She is a woman who mistakes gossip for concern and pity for kindness, Isabel said quietly from her chair. Her opinion is of no consequence. He turned his head toward her, a strange, searching expression on his face. She is the world, Miss Wentarn. She is what they all think, what they all say when my back is turned. Then the world is a fool, Isabel stated, as if it were a simple meteorological fact. He did not reply, but the tension in his shoulders eased. He had been ready for a fight, ready to retreat back into the fortress of his anger. But her quiet, unshakable certainty had disarmed him. She did not fight the world on his behalf. She simply dismissed it as irrelevant. That evening, he asked her to do something new. Walk with me, he said. Outside. It was the first time he had suggested it. Their world had thus far been confined to the house and the glass houses. He had not willingly walked in the park for years. She agreed without hesitation. He took her arm, his grip firm, trusting. It was a cool, clear evening, the air crisp with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. They walked down the long, sweeping drive, his steps slow but steady with her beside him. Tell me what you see, he commanded, his voice low. And she did. She became his eyes. She described the way the setting sun caught the tops of the ancient oaks, turning them to gold. She described the family of deer that paused to watch them from the edge of the woods. She described the state of the fences, the drainage in the north pasture, the roof of a tenant farm that needed repair. Her descriptions were, as always, precise, practical, and unsentimental. He listened, and as he listened, the estate he ruled but had abandoned began to take shape around him again. It was no longer a vague memory of green and gold, but a real place, with real needs. The next morning, for the first time in 5 years, he sent for his steward. The change in Oak Hall was subtle at first, then undeniable. The sound of hammers echoed from the roof of a distant tenant cottage. A team of woodsmen began clearing fallen timber in the east wood. The shuttered windows of the ground floor reception rooms were opened, and the dust sheets were removed. Life, slow but steady, was seeping back into the veins of the great house. The staff, who had moved with the hushed reverence of undertakers, began to walk with a lighter step. They saw their master walking in the park with Miss Wentarn. They heard the sound of his voice from the steward's office, giving clear, decisive orders. They saw the way he turned his head now, instinctively, toward the sound of her voice. They whispered amongst themselves. They watched. They waited. Benjamin felt the change in himself. It was like waking from a long, suffocating fever. The world, which had shrunk to the dimensions of a few familiar rooms, was expanding again. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. and Isabel was its architect. She did not push or pull him. She simply stood beside him, a fixed, reliable point in his darkness, and described the world until he felt brave enough to step into it. His trust in her became absolute. She was his reader, his eyes, his guide. But she was never his nurse. Her competence was a wall against the pity of others. Her presence was a quiet declaration that he was not a broken thing to be mended, but a whole man who lived differently. The Dowager Duchess arrived for a visit, her sharp eyes taking in the open windows and the air of quiet industry. She found her son in the library with Isabel, a ledger book open on the table between them. Benjamin was dictating a letter to his man of business, and Isabel was writing it down in her neat, clear hand. Dorothea watched them for a moment from the doorway, her heart aching with a fierce, complicated joy. Her son's face was no longer a mask. It was animated, engaged. He was frowning in concentration, one hand gesturing as he made a point about crop rotation. He was the man she remembered, the man she thought she had lost forever. She had brought Isabel here to save the orchids, but the girl was saving her son. Later, she found Isabel alone in the glass house, which was now a model of order and burgeoning life. New shoots were appearing on the orchids. The air was clean and sweet. "You have worked a miracle here, Miss Wentarn," the Duchess said. "The plants simply needed care, Your Grace," Isabel replied, pruning a stray tendril from a vine. "As do men," Dorothea said softly. "I am in your debt." Isabel looked up, her expression serious. "I have done nothing but my job." "My dear girl," the Duchess said, a rare smile touching her lips. "Do you think I am a fool? I know what your job is, and you are performing it magnificently." But the world Benjamin was beginning to re-enter was the same world that had rejected him. And it had left scars deeper than any wound from the war. One afternoon, searching for a particular book of maps in the library, he directed Isabel to a cabinet that had not been opened in years. Inside, she found a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to him. "What are they?" he asked, sensing her hesitation. "Letters, Your Grace. Addressed to you. From your mother." He was silent. "The dates?" She read them. They were all from the first 2 years after his return from the war. "They are unopened," she said quietly. "I see," he said, though of course he did not. "Read one." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Isabel hesitated, then untied the ribbon. The first letter was from his mother, written with a frantic, hopeful energy. She wrote of a Miss C, daughter of a viscount, a beauty with a lovely singing voice. She was coming to Yorkshire. She would be perfect. The second letter, dated a month later, was in a different tone entirely. Despairing. Miss C had come, had stayed for a polite hour, and had left, her excuses flimsy. Isabel read on, her heart growing heavy. Each letter followed the same pattern. A hopeful introduction to a suitable young lady, a carefully orchestrated meeting, and then the inevitable, humiliating retreat. The letters were a catalogue of his rejection, each one a fresh twist of the knife. He had refused to read them at the time, but he had known. He had felt the rejection in the air, in the hurried departures, in the pitying silence. When she finished the last one, the silence in the library was profound. The fire crackled, oblivious. Benjamin had not moved. He sat in his chair, his body so still he might have been carved from stone. The thaw of the past months had vanished. The glacier had returned, thicker and more impenetrable than before. He was cold and distant for days. He did not come to the glass house. He cancelled their evening readings. He spoke only to Hobbs, his valet, and then only in monosyllables. The light that had begun to dawn in Oak Hall was extinguished. Isabel was patient. She did not press him. She did not offer empty comforts. She continued her work, her routine, a steady, quiet rhythm in the silent house. She tended the orchids. She walked in the park, alone. She waited. She knew this was a battle he had to fight within himself. The world had told him he was unworthy of love. Now he had to decide whether to believe it. On the fourth night, he appeared at the door of her small sitting room. She was mending a tear in a piece of lace, her head bent over her work. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm. He did not speak, but walked to the window and stood with his back to her, staring out at the black, starless night. "They see a title," he said at last, his voice rough with unshed pain. "They see a fortune, and then they see this." He gestured vaguely at his own face, his unseeing eyes. "A broken thing, a blind man who cannot lead a dance, or see his own wife's face, a man who needs a woman to read his letters and describe the color of the sky. What woman would choose this?" The question was not for her. It was for the ghosts of all the women who had said no. It was a cry of despair from the deepest part of his soul. Isabel set down her sewing. Her hands were perfectly steady. She looked at the proud, rigid line of his back, the terrible vulnerability in his stance. This was the moment, the precipice. She did not go to him. She did not touch him. She spoke from her chair, her voice not loud, but carrying a weight of absolute conviction that cut through his despair. "A woman of sense would not choose a title or a fortune," she said clearly. She would choose a man. A woman of substance would not look for a man who could lead a dance. She would look for a man who could lead his estate with wisdom and care. He flinched, but did not turn. She would look for a man of intelligence, Isabel continued, her voice gaining strength. A man of integrity. A man of quiet strength, who has endured what would have destroyed lesser men. A man who knows every plant in his garden by its scent, and every book in his library by its place on the shelf. She paused, letting the words sink into the charged silence. Then she delivered the final, devastating truth. Such a woman would choose you. The silence that followed was absolute. He did not seem to be breathing. He was a statue, silhouetted against the window. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was a maelstrom of emotions, shock, disbelief, a fragile, dawning hope. "Isabel," he whispered, her name a prayer. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hand outstretched, not to find her, but as an involuntary gesture. This time she went to him. She stood before him and took that trembling hand in both of her own. His fingers were icy cold. She held them firmly. "I have already chosen, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. He drew in a ragged breath, and his fingers tightened around hers, clinging to her as a drowning man clings to a spar. He could not see the look on her face, the fierce tenderness, the absolute certainty. But he could feel it. In the warmth of her hands, in the steady strength of her grip, he could feel the truth of her choice. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Oak Hall was charged with a quiet, unspoken understanding. The final wall between them had not so much fallen as dissolved. Benjamin's retreat was over. He resumed their walks, their readings, their work on the estate. But everything was different. The space between them now hummed with a new energy. When he took her arm to walk, the touch was no longer merely practical. When she read to him, the words of the poets seemed to speak directly to the two of them, seated on either side of the fire. He had not yet spoken of her declaration. He had not yet given a name to what was growing between them. He seemed to be holding his breath, savouring this new, fragile peace, perhaps afraid that speaking of it would break the spell. Isabel was content to wait. She had made her choice, and she had made it aloud. The next step, the naming of things, had to be his. One crisp, late autumn morning, he sought her out in the glass house. He found her at the potting bench, her hands covered in soil. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. She cleaned her hands and followed him. But he did not lead her toward the park or the gardens. He led her through the silent, echoing corridors of the main house, his cane tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the marble floors. He led her to a part of the house she had never seen, to a pair of tall, carved doors that were closed and filmed with dust. He stopped before them. "The West Wing," he said, his voice quiet. Isabel looked at the doors. They were magnificent, their panels carved with laurels and ribbons. But they were sealed by more than dust. They were sealed by memory and pain. This was the wing his mother had spoken of, the wing that had been shuttered for 5 years. "I have not been in there since my father's time," Benjamin said. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air, until his fingers found the cold, smooth wood of the door. "This is the ballroom." The word hung in the air. A ballroom. A place of light, of music, of dancing. A place for everything he was not. Everything he thought he could never be again. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the door, his head bowed. Isabel could feel the struggle within him. This was a threshold far more daunting than the door to the glass house. "Will you?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Yes," she said softly. "I will." He did not have to ask. She knew what he needed. He needed her to go first. He needed her to be his eyes. He found the keyhole by touch, produced a key from his pocket, and turned it in the lock. The sound was loud, a grating protest. He pushed the door open and stepped back, turning his face away as if from a blast of heat. Isabel stepped over the threshold. The air inside was cold and dead. Thick dust lay over everything like a grey shroud. The vast, polished floor was a dim mirror, reflecting the ghostly shapes of shrouded chandeliers. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of dust, fell in long, slanted columns from the tall, arched windows, the only places where the shutters were not perfectly closed. The room smelled of time and stillness and forgotten things. She stood in the centre of the vast, empty space and looked back at him. He was a dark silhouette in the doorway, poised on the edge of his own past. "Tell me," he whispered. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice carrying in the echoing space. Or it was. The proportions are perfect. The ceiling is painted with clouds and cherubs. They are hard to see through the dust. The chandeliers are draped in holland covers, like sleeping ghosts. The floor is waiting for dancers. He flinched at the word. "It is a sad room," she continued quietly. "It is a room that has been left alone in the dark for too long." She watched him. He took a breath, a deep, shuddering intake of the cold, stale air. He lifted his cane, found the edge of the doorframe, and took one hesitant step. He was inside. He stood, disoriented by the vastness, the echoes that answered the tap of his cane. He was unsteady, a ship without an anchor in an unknown sea. He reached out his hand, a blind, searching gesture. Isabel crossed the floor in a few quick steps and took it. Her grip was warm and sure. He clung to her. They stood together in the center of the dusty ballroom, two small figures in a vast, sleeping space. "I cannot lead a dance," he said, the words torn from him, a confession of his deepest inadequacy. Isabel looked up at his face, at the torment etched there. "One need not dance for a room to be beautiful," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It only needs to be opened, to have the light let in." He turned his head, his unseeing eyes searching for her face. The tawny brown was clouded, but in their depths, a light she had never seen before was dawning. "Isabel," he said, her given name, the first time. It was an embrace. "Stay." It was not a question. It was a plea, a statement, a declaration. "Stay," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as a botanist, not as my reader. Stay as my wife, as my duchess." A tear she did not know she possessed slid down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. She had made her choice in a quiet sitting room in the East Wing. She had made it with words. Now she made it again, in the heart of his pain, with a simple truth. "I have already chosen," she said softly. "Benjamin?" His name on her lips was the final key. It unlocked the last bolted door. A tremor ran through him, a release of 5 years of tension, of grief, of loneliness. He lifted his free hand, and with a strange, hesitant grace, he found her face. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, her cheekbone, the curve of her lips. He could not see her, but he was seeing her more clearly than any sighted man ever could. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was a kiss of homecoming. In the dusty, silent ballroom of Oak Hall, with the columns of sunlight illuminating the air around them, the blind duke and the botanist's daughter found their beginning. The world outside would whisper. It would stare, it would judge. But inside the old stone walls, the light was being let in. Epilogue. 1 year later, the glass houses at Oak Hall were a riot of life and colour. Orchids of every conceivable shape and hue cascaded from their baskets, their fragrance scenting the warm, humid air. The glass panes sparkled, and the collection was once again the envy of the north of England. The West Wing was no longer shuttered. The ballroom had been restored to its former glory, its floors polished, its chandeliers gleaming. But it was not used for dancing. It had become a music room. On this winter afternoon, a fire blazed in the great hearth, and the Duchess of Northwell sat in a comfortable chair nearby, reading aloud from a volume of poetry. Isabel's voice was the same as it had always been, calm, clear, and intelligent. But there was a new warmth in it, a deep, settled contentment. Her sober grey dresses had been replaced by gowns of soft wool in shades of moss green and deep blue. She was expecting their first child in the spring, and her condition gave her a serene, luminous beauty. Benjamin, Duke of Northwell, sat opposite her. He was not the same man she had met a little over a year ago. The rigid, defensive posture was gone, replaced by a relaxed, easy strength. The lines of pain around his mouth had softened. He smiled often now. Small, private smiles meant only for her, that she saw and cherished. He reached out his hand, a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. His fingers found her arm easily, unerringly. He did not need to see her to know where she was. He knew the sound of her breathing, the faint rustle of her dress, the unique quality of her stillness. She was the fixed point of his universe. "Read that last part again," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. She smiled and found the line. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." As she read, he turned his head toward the tall windows. The winter sun was low in the sky, casting a pale golden light across the frosted parkland. To him, it was a bright, formless haze, a wash of brilliance against the dark. He could not see the stark, black shapes of the ancient oaks against the snow. He could not see the deep blue shadows stretching across the lawn. He could not see the robin perched on the stone balustrade. His wound had not been cured. His sight had not been miraculously restored. The darkness he lived in was permanent. Isabel finished the sonnet and looked up. She saw where his attention was directed. She knew what he saw and what he did not. "The sun has come out from behind the clouds," she said softly, her voice painting the picture for him. "It has turned the snow to the color of pale honey. The shadows of the oaks are long and purple, and there is a single robin on the railing, his chest impossibly red against the white." Benjamin smiled, his hand tightening on her arm. He could see it, through her eyes, through her voice, through the love that had altered nothing and changed everything. He could see it all. The wound remained, but it no longer defined him. It was a part of him, accommodated, understood, and shared. He was not cured. He was whole. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.